Okay, good afternoon, friends. We have an amazing topic today. A topic I actually never spoke about. A very sensitive subject. A subject relating to dilemmas of war and terror. This is a topic that I looked into but have never given before. I'm going to be speaking about it, Be'ezus Hashem, on Shavuos, but this is by way of introduction to the topic. Before we begin, I want to share with you a public service announcement. We are approaching publication of a historic publication, Sefer Tzipisa Yeshua of the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim wrote a small compendium called Tzipisa Yeshua about anticipating and waiting the coming of Mashiach. And for the first time, we're putting it out as a separate volume. This was published many years ago, actually in probably 1910. At first, when the Chafetz Chaim published it, he could not publish it as a separate volume because of censorship. And it always had to be slipped in a periodical or in some other way without it being published as a separate volume. And we hope to publish it with annotations, elucidation, translation, and many essays on the important subject of awaiting the coming of Mashiach. If anybody would like to participate in this publication, we were just at the kever of the Chafetz Chaim with a list. The kever has a list of all the svarim the Chafetz Chaim wrote, but there's like a little space, so they left us a space for one or two more of the svarim of the Chafetz Chaim that could be published. So if anybody would like to participate in this historic publication, you could let us know. We have a very important topic today, a very amazing topic, one of the dilemmas in contemporary society regarding, let me try to make this a little bit bigger. How do I make it bigger? Oh, here we go. That's good, yeah. That's good. Now, is one allowed to place themselves in mortal danger to perform halacha on Shabbos, to evacuate, or to identify bodies? We know that Shabbos is one of the most important mitzvahs in the Torah. Shabbos cannot be desecrated. Even if somebody is ill, under many circumstances, one cannot take medicine on Shabbos or cannot violate Isurei D'Rabbanan, and very often even Isurei cannot violate Isurei D'Oraisa, and very often even Isurei D'Rabbanan. The question is there any basis to allow one to desecrate Shabbos in order to evacuate a body, in order to identify a body? So you might ask, how would you be able to desecrate Shabbos to evacuate or identify a body? We know you're only allowed to desecrate Shabbos if someone's life is in danger for pikuach nefashos. Here the person is no longer alive. As the Gemara says in Masechta Shabbos, on Daf Kuf Nun Aleph Amud Beis, Tanya Rav Shimon Elazar Omer, Tinoik ben yoymai chai, ein sarich l'shoymroi min acholda umin ha'achbarim. If a child is 1 day old and alive, then you don't have to save him from a weasel or a mouse. Aval oig melech habashan meis, tzarich l'shamroi min acholda umin ha'achbarim. But more than that, the Gemara says, David Melech Yisrael meis ein mechalin olav. David HaMelech, who passed away, you cannot desecrate the Shabbos for him, because kivan shemeis adam bato min ha-mitzvahs. Right? Like it says, Tanya Rishingam Le'omer, Tinoik ben yoymai chai mechalin olav es ha-Shabbos. If you have a child who's 1 day old, you could desecrate the Shabbos. David Melech Yisrael meis ein mechalin olav es ha-Shabbos. So it doesn't matter how prestigious somebody may be, even David HaMelech, you would not be able to desecrate the Shabbos to show honor to their body. So this topic I'm sharing with you from the Sefer Ish Milchama, the Sefer Ish Milchama of Reb Tzvi Reisman. it also is in English called Exploring Halachic Dilemmas of War and Terror. But my friend, Rabbi Eli Reisman of Los Angeles, kindly sent me his father's Sefer, Ish Milchama, and this subject is thoroughly discussed in this landmark Sefer, Ish Milchama, and he brings how on Shabbos morning, Shmini Atzeres, October 7, 2023, the war that is referred to as Operation Iron Swords broke out. Hamas terrorists tore through security fences along the Israel-Gaza border, proceeded to infiltrate many nearby Israeli settlements, indiscriminately murdering over 1,200 innocent Jewish men, women, and children. Hashem Yimkam Damai. The Israeli army entered the settlements to capture or kill the terrorists and began a counter-offensive. During the weeks that followed the massacre, the long, daunting task of evacuating and identifying the bodies of the murdered and the soldiers who fell in the war was an urgent priority. Often the bodies were located in areas undergoing live fire, in areas where explosives were planted by the enemy deliberately to inhibit the IDF's rescue efforts, placing those who came to collect the dead in grave danger. Furthermore, the process of removing and identifying the bodies would often involve Chilul Shabbos. In the beginning of the war, many questions were posed to Rabbanim. These questions were not new. These are questions that were addressed in prior wars, like the War of Attrition, 1969 to 1970, the Yom Kippur War in 73, the First Lebanon War, 82. Are you allowed to put your life in danger to evacuate bodies? Are you allowed to do malacha on Shabbos to evacuate bodies? Are you allowed to do malacha on Shabbos to identify bodies? Now, we're not talking about a situation where, let's say, the bodies laying strewn on the battlefield could spread disease and endanger people's lives. Then obviously you're allowed to desecrate the Shabbos to evacuate the bodies. What we're now going to discuss is a very sensitive topic. And I didn't even allude to what I'm referring to, but we're going to come to it. Now, to travel to the bodies in a motor vehicle, it could be Isser D'Oraisa to D'Rabbanan on Shabbos. To leave the Tchum D'Oraisa is 24,000 Amos. Tchum D'Rabbanan is 2,000 Amos. The corpse is Muksa. That's another prohibition you have to navigate. And furthermore, the Gemara says in Sanhedrin that you're not allowed to bury someone on Shabbos, even a meis mitzvah. Let's take a look in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says, the Shulchan Aruch tells us in Arachayim Taf Kuf Chaf Vav Seif Gimel B'Shabbos uV'Yom Kippurim lo yisasku b'I klal. On Shabbos and Yom Kippur, you're not allowed to involve yourself in the burial of a Jew, afilu al yidei amimin, even through a Gentile, afilu lahoitzia al yidei malanichai bechuch, even to remove them through Goyim and to leave them in some kind of dug-out cave, ha'asuya mei esmo, that was made the day before. Did you know that? Even for a meis mitzvah, not only could you not violate a dead body, not only can you not violate a d'oraisa to bury a meis mitzvah on Shabbos, you can't even violate amira la'akum. That's a chidush. Why can you violate a d'Rabbanan? So the Mishnah Berurah comes, and an amazing Mishnah Berurah. He says, what do you mean? It's only muksa al yedei a goy. The halacha is, you're allowed to ask a guy to move muksa on Shabbos. There's no isser of amira la'akum on muksa. You're not allowed to tell a guy to do malacha. You're allowed to tell a guy to move muksa. So here, you're just telling him to move a body, and it's kavod ames. Says the Mishnah Berurah, af agav de eino ela tilta yedei nachri. It's only moving through a guy. Lairatzu lahater mishum kavod ames. They don't want to matter it because of kavod ames. Adarabba, just the opposite. Kavod hamesu shelo yischalel Shabbos v'yom Kippurim dechamiri al yadai. Honor of the mess is he should not be a source of Sabbath desecration. Do you hear this? You would think it's an honor for the mess to bury him. No, it's an honor for the mess that he should not be the cause of Shabbos desecration. That's an amazing idea. And this is discussed in the Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, in Simin Samach Aleph. Why don't we relax the Isser of Tiltal because of Kavod Hames? What's the reason for that? V'zoi shenis hakaman d'mikamakam b'Shabbos asur likbar afilu al yidei amiro l'nachri afilu muto b'bizayin usriach. Even if the body is lay in desecration and is putrid, even though they permitted many isurei d'Rabbanan because of kavod habriyos. They permitted tiltal avanim, mikur zalois, b'shas bebeis hakisei, v'talish in mitzuyesas kalacha bekarmelis. So koshekain, they should allow amir la'akam. In other words, there are many Isurei D'Rabbanan that are relaxed for important purposes. Certainly we should allow Amir La'akam, V'al karcha chaynu mitam shekaso rishonim shegenaihu lemes sheneschal Shabbos ba'avurai. It's a genai for a mess that Shabbos should be desecrated for him. V'imkein masha mashbiach b'chvoidoi b'mehirus kvurasai. That which you enhance his kavod by expediting his burial, poigim b'bizayon chelo Shabbos. You infringe on his kavod by having the Shabbos desecrated on his behalf. It's a very interesting, he brings in the Sefer Ish Milchama that during the war of Yehuda HaMaccabee against the Syrian Greeks, the Jewish warriors did not remove the dead from the battlefield on Shabbos. Instead, they waited until the next day. So, the question would be, what basis would there be to allow the removal of a soldier who unfortunately is laying slain on the battlefield on Shabbos? What basis is there for that? The basis for that is a very interesting factor. Will this affect the mindset, the state of mind of the soldiers? Yeah, Reb Josh, you could attest to the importance of people having the right mindset in terms of your professional work, right? So the factor that we're going to deal with here is if the soldiers who are fighting on the battlefield encounter a dead body, will this affect their morale and it will weaken their resolve and perhaps put their lives in danger? In other words, are we allowed to evacuate the bodies on Shabbos in order so as not to weaken the morale of the soldiers fighting the war? In other words, what role does trauma play in pikuach nefashos and shmira Shabbos? A very interesting topic. Okay, so is this apt to cause a weakening of the morale? So we begin with the Yalkut Shimoni. Yalkut Shimoni is found in B'Shalach, Remez Kuf Chav Zayin, where it says, God said, Vayihi b'Shalach para yesham v'lo nacham Elokim derech eretz Pelishtim ki karayfu ki amar Elokim pen yinachem ha'am b'roisam milchama v'shav Mitzrayim. Simply it means that the people would get afraid of the war that they would encounter in Gaza and turn back. But the Medrash says, no, what we were afraid of, we have a tradition that before Klal Yisrael left Mitzrayim, the Bnei Ephraim left 30 years earlier, and they were killed in battle, and their bodies lay strewn in Gaza. And Hashem was afraid that if the Jewish people would leave Egypt through that route, they would see dead bodies, it would weaken their resolve, and if they would have to fight a war, they would lose the war. The Yalkut Shimoni says, Zu milchemes b'nei Ephraim, shenemar, uvnei Ephraim shuselach, v'zeved b'noi, v'haragom anshe gas, al lo yishamru bris Elokim, al sha'avru al haketz, v'al sha'avru al hashua. But then the Yaakov brings another pshat. Davar achar kidei shelo yiru es atzmois achihem. So they should not see the bones of their brothers, mushlachim bepilsha bepileshes v'yachzulhem, strewn in pileshes and turn back. So we see that seeing bones, seeing a dead body, is likely to weaken resolve. So the presence of bodies on a battlefield can diminish the resolve of the living soldiers. You know, we also find that later on Klal Yisrael said, better to die in Mitzrayim than to die in the Midbar. And the Mechilta says, if we die in Mitzrayim, at least we'll have burial and a hesped. If we die in the Midbar, our bodies will just be laying in the heat or in the frost of the night. Rabbi Victor Nevenzel says there is support that a soldier could be stricken emotionally by seeing a dead body from Shmuel Beis. In Shmuel Beis we find that in Shmuel Beis, Perek Beis, Pasuk Chav Gimel, Vayima'ein lasur. And he refused to turn aside. Vayakeo Avner ba'acharei hachanis. Avner struck him down after the spear. El hachoimesh. Vatetze hachanis me'acharav. Vayipol sham vayamas tachtav. Asoel had fallen dead. Vayihi kol haba el hamakoim. And anyone who came to the place, Asher nafal sham asal, where Asal fell, Vayamais dead. Vayamoidu. They stood still. They were in shock. They couldn't move on. The encountering the dead body shocked them. They had trauma. Vayamoidu amdu misbalim v'chadlu meilirdaif. They stood bewildered and they stopped running away. Seeing a dead body could cause someone to be panic-stricken and frozen. Furthermore, we read in Shmuel Beis that Amasa, the general of David's army, was killed, and the pasuk describes the reaction the soldiers had. The pasuk says, "Amasa mizgoylel ba'adam." Amasa was rolling, wallowing in blood, b'soich hamasila, on the path. And Vayar ha'ish, the man saw ki amad kol ha'am, that the whole people were standing, b'soich hamasila, in the path. And basically, Vayarish ki amad kol ha'am, everyone just stood there. Everyone was frozen. Vayase v'samasim and amasila. So he turned Amasa away from the path. Vayashech olav beged, he threw a garment on him. Again, Mitzudas David explains that when anybody saw Amasa dead, they were frozen in place. Vayar ha'ish ha'omed al cholal ra asher kol mi shabal l'makom ha'cholal hayanishar omed. They just stood there. V'loi ha'ila az harasai. And his warning did not help. So in other words, we see from here that seeing an unburied soldier left out in the open could affect the emotional state of the comrades of the soldier. So does this detrimental effect that this have on the other soldiers, does this create a situation of pikuach nefashos, that we need to desecrate the Shabbos, let's say, to evacuate these dead bodies? So, in an article in Techumen, volume 22, pages 104 to 115, he cites a number of wartime cases and the issues of relocating the soldiers, and that this question was brought to Reb Shlomo Goren. Let me see if I could find for you what Rabbi Goren wrote. Mm-hmm. And Rav Goren wrote as follows: This is from the Sefer Ish Milchama, Ratz Katzvi. He brings that Rev Goren, this again in the war of attrition in 1969, 1970, and in 1973, Rev Goren wrote, Me'achar uvetnai halachima hakayomim bekav hata'ala uvimotzave habika hasharas hachalal shalanu b'makom nefilas l'meshach yom sham alul ufka kasher v'kosher halachima. Since because of the fighting conditions, leaving the body for a full day could have a very negative effect on the chayalim, uve moral shalahem, and their morale. And he brings a raya from the Yalkut Shemini that we cited. Lachein behis chashev beragishus hanefashis hamyucheda sheishonu klape beinenu hanoflim. Considering the sensitivity of the soldiers to their comrades, Kivan shepinoi biadayim shaloi berechav mahava sakana lemifnim ha'alulim lipaga me'esh ha'oyev toch kedei halicha beregal. If we're going to require our soldiers to evacuate the bodies on foot, they could be endangering their lives because they're going to be encountering enemy fire. Anu matirim lifnois hachalolim berechav b'Shabbos l'makam hakar b'yosef shmes chalom. Rav Goren paskin that it would be permitted to evacuate the slain to a nearby spot. You can't move them to the special area, the special facility for fallen soldiers, but you would be able to move them on Shabbos. However, Rav Goren says that this is only when the soldier died on Friday night or Shabbos morning. Why? Because if you don't evacuate them, they're going to lay there for a long time. But if the soldier fell after midday, leave them until Matzah Shabbos, if you could cover them with some kind of cloth and provide them some kind of shmira, as long as it's not putting any other soldiers in danger. So in other words, Rav Goren did allow, because of the weakening of the morale of other soldiers, in a situation where they would have to lay there either from Friday night or Shabbos morning, to evacuate the soldiers on Shabbos. Rav Halpern commented on the heter of Rav Goren that it would only apply in a very specific case, when the soldier is lying there on the battlefield and the other comrades are continuing to fight. But if the war in that area is over and they've moved on to elsewhere, so in other words, if the soldiers are going to continue to fight and the sight would cause them emotional harm, then they could evacuate. But if the body is now lying in an area and the soldiers are not there, so for example, in the war of attrition, they had not yet found a heter to move the body. Only in a situation where they were continuing to fight in that area. Now Rav Halpern continued that he recounted the events that happened on Shemini Atzeres in 1973. It was a Thursday during the Yom Kippur War. Basically, on the Yom Kippur War, one of the fortresses was conquered by the Egyptians in the beginning of the war, then was freed by Tzahal, and there were many corpses that were there and had to be relocated because of the very strong odor and the emotional harm of the soldiers who were stationed there. And in that case, Rav Halpern, so to speak, mustered up the halachic courage, and he gave, he permitted the evacuation of these bodies for two reasons. Number one was to travel on Yom Tif in a vehicle is only a D'Rabbanan. It was Yom Tif, it was Shmini Atzeres, it was not Shabbos. And number two, because of the impact on the morale of the soldiers. 2 days later, it was Parshas Bereshis, now it's Shabbos, and the Israeli army got word that there were a lot of casualties. Okay? So Shabbos, Tavshin Lamed Daled, 1973. And Rav Goren was in the division headquarters. What happened was the division chief of staff sent him a personal note that had a brief and very shocking description of the situation. Rav Goren thought about the question. He asked, Rav Halpern says, he asked my opinion. I assessed that it was a very difficult situation. The war was in full swing. The fighting forces were passing by the bodies, and Rav Halpern said that under the circumstances, he assessed that this was a situation of pikuach nefashos. That this was a situation of pikuach nefashos. I'm going to go back because we have over here in the Sefer Darchei Chesed. Darchei Chesed was written by Rabbi Avram Avidan in Perek Yud in a footnote number 2, that he records the conversation he had with Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach of when it's permitted to evacuate a corpse on Shabbos. Of when it's permitted to evacuate a corpse on Shabbos. And Rav Shlomo Zalman set forth the following rule. Rav Shlomo Zalman said, "Shatzidei loymar klal gadol b'inyan zeh, v'hu shekol she'inyan pinoi hachalala ma'orer ba'hala gam b'yimei sachal." Anytime the evacuation of a corpse, anytime seeing a dead body would engender panic, even during the weekday, umemarim lefnoisam, and during the week you would rush to clear out the body, lemnoya moirach lev, to prevent people from becoming incapacitated out of shock. Mutter lefnoisam b'Shabbos, you'd be allowed to evacuate them on Shabbos. Shemidas habahala moira al hadachivas v'achashivas sheish lepinoi. If there would have been panic, in other words, if it would induce panic during the week, that reflects the urgency of the issue, and you'd be allowed to clear it out on Shabbos. So that was the psak that Rav Avram Avidan quoted from none other than Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Basically, Rabbi Yeshua ben Meir also heard a ruling from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he wrote in the name of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach that if there's harm to a soldier's morale, who they're going to see that if they would fall in battle, if they're going to think that nobody is going to come pick them up and they're going to lie in the battlefield and no one's going to attend to them, it's going to cause a loss in their fighting spirit, and that would be considered pikuach nefashos. So basically, Rav Halpern summarized these rulings, and let me show it to you in where it's quoted here. Let me see. Okay, so he summarized his ruling as follows. B'shum panim ein l'saken chaye adam l'tzorchei pinoi chalalim ela im ismalim shnei tanam. It is prohibited to endanger anyone's life to evacuate bodies unless you could fulfill the following 2 stipulations. Number 1, yesh chashivus yashira shel hapinoi hamaidi lehimashech hamaamatz hamalchamti. Number 1, removing them immediately is directly important to the continuation of the war front. In other words, it would only be permitted to endanger, in other words, until now we're talking about Chilul Shabbos, but Chilul Shabbos will go hand in hand with whether you could risk your life to evacuate a dead body. Because if you can't desecrate Shabbos, then you certainly can't risk someone's life to evacuate a dead body. If you could desecrate Shabbos, that means it's an issue of pikuach nefashos, then perhaps somebody could put their life in danger to evacuate a body. So it would only be permitted to to put someone's life in danger if it is of immediate importance to the war front. And number 2, the decision to evacuate has to be based on a level-headed report of an officer and not just in the heat of the moment out of a sense of panic or fear. So in the war of attrition and the Yom Kippur War, the heter was given because of the continuous efforts of the war front and a situation b'koach nefashos, if we would not remove the bodies, that it was permitted to evacuate bodies on Shabbos, and not only that, but to endanger the lives of soldiers to help evacuate these bodies. Now, Rav Halprin then published these rulings in the Sefer Refuah Metzios VaHalacha in Siman Yod Aleph. He brought an example of the deep emotional impact that being exposed to a corpse could have, and what halachos we could learn from this. So during the Intifada in 2001, let's see, a terrible story and a terrible question that was brought to Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein in the Intifada in 2001. Basically, suicide bombers detonated explosives in the public area in Eretz Yisrael. It resulted in many civilian casualties. And after the slaughter that took place on Friday night, Shabbos Parshas Nasai, in the Dolphinarium in Tel Aviv, Rabbi Yaakov Roja, who is the halachic authority of Zaka, he today is a member of the chief rabbinate, posed the question to Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein whether it's permitted to evacuate these bodies who were loyalenu blown up during the bomb. Could they go to the side of the terrorist attack? But so the specific question asked was, can they return home on Shabbos driven by a non-Jew? The question was, la'achar hatabach shetavchu harviyim below Shabbos Parshas Nasai Tavshin Samachalcha in Tel Aviv. So the Zaka went to identify the bodies, and they traveled with Nahag Goy. Could they return on Shabbos? And Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein said, Niroli Shemuter. Why? Because there's a chashash of pikuach nefashos if the bodies just are going to remain on the highway. Why is that? Listen to what Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein said. The Avoyu, why would it be sakanas nefashos to leave the bodies there on Shabbos? He says, V'yavoyu ha'horam v'yiruzois him yisalfu v'yavoyu l'sakana. If heaven forbid the parents should have to see the dead bodies of their children, they might faint and they might have a heart attack. Therefore, Zaka needs to come and remove the bodies. Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein says that a certain doctor, Dr. Kuznik, told him that a young girl once came to the scene of the tragedy and had a heart attack. A young girl came to the scene, Vikibla Haskaf Lev, and she wasn't related. She wasn't even related to the deceased. She had to be hospitalized. One time, one of the doctors was dealing with the bodies of the deceased. The doctor saw his son, and the doctor lost his sanity. The doctor lost his sanity. So, therefore, Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein said, in order to prevent such a tragedy, Zaka would be allowed to desecrate Shabbos to travel to the terror scene, and if they're allowed to travel, they could return through a non-Jew. So again, we see from Rabbi Zilberstein's psak that the sight of a corpse can lead to emotional distress, can lead to a life-threatening situation. Therefore, they're allowed to do malacha on Shabbos to relocate the corpse in such a circumstance. Now, after the Yom Kippur War, he asked Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Gustman whether it was permitted to desecrate Shabbos to identify, evacuate these bodies, and Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rav Gustman both agreed that it was permitted. This is page 29. Okay. So this was reiterated in a letter that Yeshua ben Meir wrote to Rabbi Halperin. Rav ben Meir discusses the conversation he had with Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, in which Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach ruled that it's regarding evacuating Israeli soldiers that were done on the first day of Sukkot during the Yom Kippur War. Their bodies were in the Golan Heights, near the route taken by soldiers on the way to their posts. So a few weeks later, the letter goes, after the ceasefire, Rav ben Meir went to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. It was late at night. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach already called it a night, but he came out to see him, and Rav ben Meir told Rav Shlomo Zalman the story. He wanted to know if it was permitted for him to drive on Yom Tif to evacuate the bodies. And Rav Shlomo Zalman said, no. This is ridiculous. You're asking the question of an Am Haaretz. I want to show you this letter inside. He said, you're asking the question of an Am Haaretz. You shouldn't be asking that, are you allowed to evacuate the bodies on Shabbos? You should be asking, are we allowed to, were you allowed to endanger your life to go rescue them? In other words, you should have asked whether it was permitted to put yourself in Sakanas Nefashos while the area was being shelled. You told me there were 2 other soldiers who were wounded. So you shouldn't be asking whether you're allowed to desecrate Shabbos to evacuate the bodies. You should be asking whether you're allowed to put yourself in danger to desecrate the bodies. If you're allowed to put yourself in danger, then you're allowed to desecrate Shabbos. Look, he says, Atasho she'elo shel am haaretz. The question is, are you allowed to put yourself and the chayalim in a makam sakana? And so Rav ben Meir responded to Rav Shlomo Zalman, okay, you're saying good. Was I allowed to put myself in sakana to rescue these soldiers? And Rav Shlomo Zalman thought about it, and he says, yes, it is permitted. Shlomo Zalman said that he heard during the war of attrition something amazing. I guess the war of attrition is ha-ha-tasha. The question that Rav Goren permitted soldiers from the military rabbinate to be sent to fortresses on Pesach to make the fortresses kosher lePesach, even though it was a place of sakana and some soldiers had been killed, even though the soldiers that they were going to kosher the kitchens for Pesach had no interest in eating kosher lePesach food. They didn't want kosher lePesach food. And Rav Shlomo Zalman said that Rav Goren was correct. Why? Because for the military rabbinate to exercise its authority and to come and forbid the soldiers from eating chametz on Pesach, it gives the soldiers the feeling that they're part of the halachic system of the state of Israel, and they're subject to the rabbinate's restrictions, and it will strengthen their morale, knowing that the government and the rabbinate stands behind them, even though they don't want the rabbinate to stand behind them. They don't want to keep the halacha, but knowing that the rabbinate is risking their life to impose halacha on them strengthens the morale of the soldiers. What an amazing svara that Rav Goren came up with, that Rav Shlomo Zalman endorsed. In other words, you have soldiers, you have secular soldiers. They don't want kosher food. They want to eat pizza on Pesach. They said, if I eat matzah, I'm going to get a stomach ache. I don't like matzah. I don't want matzah. I'll fight better with pizza made with treif cheese with pig on it. I want to eat chazer. I fight better eating chazer. No, you're allowed to risk your life to impose that they should eat matzah and macaroons on Pesach. Why? Because deep down they know that if they're under the auspices of the rabbinate, and the rabbinate is imposing halacha, then the state is behind them and the rabbin is behind them, and it will strengthen their morale. Now, so then maybe you'll say, are you allowed to cook food for soldiers on Shabbos? Because, they don't want to eat cold cholent. They want hot cholent. It will strengthen their morale. So Rav Shlomo Zalman added something very important. Rav Shlomo Zalman added, don't learn from here that you're allowed to desecrate Shabbos for soldiers to warm up hot food for them because that will strengthen their morale. Rav Shlomo Zalman said you need a lot of Yira Shamayim to know in reality what in fact strengthens the soldiers' morale and what weakens their morale. It strengthens their morale if the rabbinate risks their life to impose kosher Pesach food because they know the state's behind them, but it doesn't strengthen the morale if they're going to have a better food to eat. What an amazing svara, really remarkable. But basically, from the words of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, we get a clear picture over here. Damage to the soldiers' morale could affect their desire and their ability to fight, and therefore having bodies on the battlefield could cause a severe impact on the morale, and therefore poses a situation of pikuach nefashos. Here's another amazing svara. This is something from the Sefer Meishiv Milchama, also is written by Rav Goren. This sounds very reasonable. This comes from the Sefer Meishiv Milchama, Simin Kuf Yud Zayin. In the past, historically, when Israeli corpses are captured, Egyptians, Syrians, terrorists extorted large concessions from us that if we want our corpses back, in exchange for that we have to release terrorists. We all know Yahya Sinwar, Yamach Shemoy. And now Baruch Hashem, his brother is united with him. So now they're together in the netherworld. God is reconstituting their molecules every moment to inflict more harm on them. They were released, Sinwar was released in exchange for the body of one soldier. So we see, if we let our corpses remain in the battlefield, you'll say it's not pikuach nefashos. You're not to desecrate Shabbos for a mess. You're right, you're not. But in this situation, this dead body represents the loss of life. Because if we let the body fall into the hands of the enemy, do you know how many terrorists they're going to try to extract in exchange for that dead body? So are you going to tell me it's not sakonas nefashos to rescue that dead body on Shabbos? In the times that we live in, what we have to give up to get back one body? Now after, 60 years, Syria falls, maybe we'll get back Eli Cohen, right? Now they're talking about finding his remains. But otherwise, in order for us to release a dead hostage, we have to exchange it for murderers. So therefore, says Rav Goren, they've demanded that we give up many of our rights in exchange for the release of dead bodies. So since murdered soldiers who fall in the hands of Israel's enemies are the greatest means of political, diplomatic, and military concessions, we have to do everything in our power to evacuate the casualty as quickly as possible, because you know how much sakonas nefashos you're preventing. So therefore, think about it. An Israeli body is a weapon in the hand of the enemy to extort concessions. So therefore, when Gentiles besiege, Rav Goren said the halacha is when a Gentiles besiege a border city, we're even allowed to desecrate Shabbos if they're just trying to take away stubble or straw. We wage war. Certainly we're allowed to desecrate the Shabbos to protect the bodies of our fallen so that they don't fall into the hand of the enemy. I think the tragic reality bears testimony to the correctness of this svara, that to leave the dead body in the hand of the enemy on the battlefield, forget the morale of the living soldiers. You're putting the entire society of Yidden who live in Israel in danger if you leave them there. One more amazing svara, okay? This was offered by Rav Gad Navon, who was the chief military rabbi in the 1982 Lebanon War. He gave another reason to allow the evacuation of bodies on Shabbos. He says, let's see, I want to take you back to the Sefer Ratz Katzvi. We're going to say, okay. The Rav Gad Navon wrote, he says something very powerful. He says, this doesn't apply in every situation. But very often, failure to evacuate the body immediately will result in an inability to identify the body later. Because sometimes the body lays there in the heat, it's defiled, and if we don't identify that body right away, the woman will be if it's a married person, the woman will remain in aguna, and if the woman remains in aguna, maybe because of her state of aguna, she will leave observance and she will commit adultery. Otherwise, she's going to be trapped for the rest of her life. So you say, what precedent is there that in order to prevent a woman from being an aguna, you're allowed to desecrate Shabbos? There's a Rashba quoted by the Beis Yosef in Archaim Simin Shin Vav. The Beis Yosef rules in the name of the Rashba. A girl was kidnapped by non-Jews, but her life is not in danger. The Rashba allows Chilul Shabbos to rescue the girl, because not rescuing her could lead her to desecrate Shabbos for the rest of her life. Meaning her life is not in danger. But if you don't rescue this girl, she's going to be desecrating Shabbos for the rest of her life. Now, there's a general rule. We don't allow a person to do a small sin so that his fellow could benefit. We don't tell someone do a small avera to save your friend from a great avera. But under certain circumstances, we let the owner of an Eved Kanani, even though he's not allowed to free his slave, we let him free the slave in order for him to be Mekai in the mitzvah of Puravu. Now, normally, if you own an Eved Kanani, you're over an asay if you free the Eved Kanani. However, there is basis. There is basis that someone who is a Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Choyren, we force the owner to make him free, even though he's over an asay, because Periya Verivya is a mitzvah rabbah. So for the sake of a mitzvah rabbah, we'll say you could violate a small sin to avoid someone violating a great sin. Likewise, we will desecrate Shabbos to save a girl who's kidnapped, because if we don't, very likely she'll never keep Shabbos again. So too, Reb Navon says, if we're not able to identify the body, it could cause a woman to be an aguna, and then maybe she'll end up being mizaneh, and she'll violate adultery. So perhaps it's worthwhile to desecrate a somewhat small sin, relatively. Obviously, desecrating Shabbos is a great sin, but in comparison to the woman committing adultery for the rest of her life, perhaps there's basis to identify the body. One more factor that Rav Halperin writes, desecrating Shabbos in order to identify the dead. Rav Halperin said that great efforts were expended to prevent unnecessary acts of Chilul Shabbos identifying the body. In other words, they told some of the soldiers who were tasked with identifying the body that to try to avoid Chilul Shabbos at all costs, namely, So they didn't want to desecrate Shabbos, but at the same time they needed to make every effort to not to lose critical identification during the evacuation. So they wanted to preserve the data. Therefore, they came up with ways to memorize the identifying information about the armored vehicles and the bodies, and then the information was recorded right after Shabbos. So Rabbi Meir wrote to Rav Shlomo Zalman. He says, I told Rabbi Shlomo Zalman that, we didn't allow the men of the burial to write on Shabbos the list of the names that they evacuated. And Rabbi Shlomo Zalman was not so happy with that. He said, according to his opinion, since there will be many slain, and there's a chazaka that a mace is forgotten, and it could be a long-standing problem. Furthermore, if there's a soldier who's gone missing, it causes emotional harm for a long time. Furthermore, the soldier's own concern that if he dies, his wife will remain in Aguna and his descendants will not be able to inherit him. It might impact his willingness to put his life on the line. So, Rav Shlomo Zalman, in other words, was hemming and hawing. Maybe they do need to write the names of the soldiers and the information they got from the battlefield of slain soldiers. So Rabbi Meir says, is the Rav saying that we could actually make lists on Shabbos? Maybe we should write it with a shinoi in order to preserve the information. So Rav Shlomo Zalman said, look, after the war, you need to gather all the rabbis and all the dayanim, and you need to deal with this issue. It's a very delicate psak. Rav Shlomo Zalman said, in my opinion, it's mutter, but I'm afraid to issue, I can't give a heter on my own. So Rabbi Meir says, so what should we do in the meantime? Until we make this big delegation and this big conference, what should we do? Rav Shlomo Zalman said, you have to follow the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says that when there's safek pikuach nefashos, anyone who asks shailos is a murderer. In other words, Rav Shlomo Zalman said, when there's a question of pikuach nefashos, anyone who delays to ask a shaila is considered a murderer. Meaning, basically, don't ask me shailas. This is a safek pikuach nefashos, and therefore you need to do everything you can to preserve the sustained life and morale of the soldiers. So, one thing we learned from here is that the morale of a human being is considered integral to their viability, and emotional health is considered as important, if not more important, than physical health, and a lack of emotional health could be very possibly a cause for sakanas nefashos. And therefore, sometimes if somebody Layalenu is faced with a patient who's suffering severe emotional health, and one is not sure, do we need to be mechalo Shabbos for them? It's very likely that would warrant chilo Shabbos. And Rav Shlomo Zalman said he's very afraid to issue a psak, and on the other hand, he said in the interim, until you know a psak, to follow the recommendation of the Yerushalmi that when someone's life is possibly in danger, one cannot wait to ask questions. So I found this a very amazing topic. I want to thank my friend Reb Eli Reisman for sending me his father's Sefer Ishmael Chama of Reb Tzvi Reisman. And Bez Hashem, if you're in the neighborhood, you could join us Shavuos night, where we're going to be speaking about many halachic dilemmas of war and terror. And the Rebbeinu Shem should give us only shalom v'shalva, so we shouldn't have to face such tumultuous questions. Okay, Rabbi, say thank you for joining today. Have a wonderful day. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why part of why Rav Shlomo Zalman was not really at ease with the memorizing the information. I guess you're right. If it's more than written down, if it's, let's say, typed into a system, so then it goes to the cloud, and it's saved. Yeah, it's questionable if you're going to be relying. First of all, memory is not foolproof, and maybe something will happen to the person.
You should know from it.
Yeah. Okay, Rabbi Isai, have a beautiful day. Kol Tov.